My name is Alex Babeanu. I'm an identity solutions architect for a company called Nulli. We're based in Western Canada. We're a consulting firm. And our role is to help our customers implement sometimes very complex identity and access management solutions, including for CIAM. So I'd like to start by asking you all a question. Do you remember the music you were listening to when you were a teenager? Do you still listen to the same music? Back when I was a teenager, that was in the 80s in France, there were mainly three groups of people in my school. There were the people who were listening to New Wave back then, right? Remember? The Cure, Depeche Mode, Tears for Fears, right? And then there were the pop music fans. They were listening to Michael Jackson, Cyndi Lauper, Madonna. Remember that? And of course, last but not least, the hard rockers. Yeah, Iron Maiden, Motley Crue, Scorpions, right? Those were the cool kids. There were lots of them, and they could even recognize each other because they had the same dress code, right? Remember that? Me, on the other hand, well, I was listening to prog rock back then. My favorite band was called Marillion. Has everybody ever heard of Marillion? Oh, we should talk afterwards. That's great. Anybody else? Wow, look at that, 4 of us. That's about right. How about Rush? Any Rush fans? Yeah, okay. So in my school, there were maybe like 3 people listening to that stuff. We felt a bit lonely, right? Anyway, this, by the way, is a graph. Everybody's familiar with graphs? Yeah? Basically just a bunch of nodes, the bubbles, connected by arrows, relationships. It makes it easy to represent any kind of data like that, and maybe even able to read it easily. So anyway, let's fast forward to nowadays. My tastes have completely evolved to a mix of jazz, funk, and world music. So bands like Ezra Collective, Polyrhythmics. If you know any of these bands, let's talk afterwards. So anyway, what's the difference between those 2 images? Anybody want to venture a guess? Can you spot the differences? Yes, good one. Location. Canada. I live in Canada now, not in France anymore. Anything else? Yeah, the band names. How about maybe date as well? Well, in short, we could summarize this or generalize it by saying it's a different context. And as we will see, context is very important for customer identity and access management. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about today, identity in context. Then we'll have a look at the challenges of customer identity and access management. We'll have a look at IRM, identity relationship management, and see how that can help alleviate those problems. And then we'll have some examples, real-life examples, of how to use IRM for authentication and authorization. All right? So identity in context. First of all, what do we mean by context? Context really is what defines the circumstances or setting of something, right? Context can be of different types. It could be geographical, like a location. It could be temporal, like date or time of day. It could be monetary, like, for example, purchase history. It could be anything, really, anything that is related to an identity at any given time. And that's actually quite an important thing, because context is dynamic. It can change in real time even. So how does that impact our identities, like customer identities in particular? I'm sure we all know that the identity we are using depends on the context we are in. I'm sure you all have different identities here, like me, for example. This is my daytime me. And in my daytime me, this is my identity when I'm in the context of Nulli, my employer. This is my identity with my identifier down there. But this is me in the evenings. I play drums in a band in Vancouver. And in the evening, sometimes I shop for cymbals. Yeah, I do that. So in the context of Long & McQuaid, which is a retailer in Canada, this is my other identity. So as you can see, I choose the identity depending on the context I'm in. So let's do a quick reality check here. This is an example taken from a use case we've had with a client last year. I've changed the names, but the use case is exactly the same. And we'll see how identity and context interact. Let's imagine we're a company called Mothership Corp. And we are interested in sporting goods. So much so that over the years, we've acquired a bunch of brands. We have shoes, they sell shoes, sports shoes. Track Me, they sell tracking devices. And Wear It, they sell sports outwear. Great. Let's meet Maurice Moss. IT crowd fans? Good. So Maurice is a sysadmin, and he's heard that running would do him good. So he bought some shoes and some outwear because he had nothing. So far, so good. So what is our problem here from Mothership Corp? Our problem is we would like to find our duplicate accounts in order to create a client 360-degree view of the clients we have. Why? In order to drive sales through recommendations. Because if Maurice bought some shoes and some shirts, it might be a good idea to sell Maurice a watch, maybe a tracking watch, right? Here's another example of identity in context. This one I call one login. This time we are a university. Let's call it Stanvard. Sounds a bit like a university where Thor could have studied, you know, in Asgard. Anyway. We have 4 web apps. Well, actually, they have much more than that, but just to keep it simple. So one for prospects where, you know, applicants can register. They have a mini course app where they sell short duration courses for cheaper. They have a faculty app and a grad programs app where if you're a student, you can go there and check your stuff. All right, so that's the picture. Meet Roy. Roy is Maurice's best friend. He's also a sysadmin. And it turns out he had lots of spare time on his hands. So he decided to enroll in the faculty and and teach some courses. And since he was there, he decided to also follow an MBA. So he created this account. But Roy also forgot that ages ago, he was an applicant to that university, and he still has this account lying around, this identity there. So what is our problem from Stanford's standpoint? Well, once again, we would love to be able to find the duplicates in order to create a client 360-degree view. Why? Again, to drive sales through recommendations, because we could probably sell a mini course to Roy, maybe. It also provides us with maybe a profile that we can use in the back end with our own internal apps. But another reason we would like to do this is in order to enable to create a one login page for all these apps, because of course right now they all have their own login pages. We all are familiar with this use case, SSO and all that. And why do we do that? Well, to improve user experience, of course. But how do we do that? By reducing friction. And we'll get back to friction in a second. So in short, be context aware when you're dealing with customer identity and access management. So what are the challenges we're facing with CIAM? I mean, I'm sure we all have experiences, frustrating ones, when we're trying to log into some e-commerce website that we've forgotten the password for, or even our username. So anyway, as identity professionals, our challenge is usually a trade-off between security and end-user friction. The more security there is, the more friction there is. And by security here, I mean this in a very generic term. It is, of course, authentication, authorization, but also, you know, all the privacy requirements, maybe consent management. Maybe you want to have your users consent to receive a newsletter and things like that. So the more security you have, the more friction you have. So what is friction? Well, essentially friction is anything that stands between the user and the stuff you're trying to sell the user. Simple as that. So friction usually translates into either account lockouts or people re-registering and then coming back to those use cases we saw before. And so you want to reduce friction at all costs because in the end, it has an impact on your bottom line. So what can we do? Oh, actually, yeah, I forgot this one. Some interesting facts, actually, that Google just published a month ago, actually. 38% of the users do not have access to their phone when challenged. So if you're relying on some kind of a device to recover your client's accounts, well, in 38% of the cases, they will not have a phone on them, maybe it's in the kitchen or something, and they will just drop the transaction right there. 34% of the users can't recall their secondary email address. Well, that again, this translates into loss of transactions and can be a serious problem. What can we do? Well, let's have a look at identity relationship management. We believe IRM can greatly help and alleviate those problems, even though it's probably not a silver bullet for all the problems. It can greatly help. So what exactly is IRM? Well, it's the management of an identity's relationships. It says in the title. It's basically managing an identity's context. So what can you do? What are the tools that you need for this? Well, we believe you need two tools. First of all, you need to realize that the relationships are actually first-class citizens in your system. They're as important as your client, as your devices, as your users. So you need to persist them in your backend as such. And I've showed you a bunch of graphs so far. We believe the best way to do this is to use a graph database. Now, that in itself is a whole topic. We could talk for hours about it. But come talk to me afterwards if you want to have more details there. We've tried with other types of stores like LDAP and SQL and all that. Nothing compares for relationships. The second tool you would need is a relationship manager. It's a component that can actually do CRUD operations on your relationships. You know, create, update, delete relationships. That component should also be able to act as a policy decision point to answer policy decisions or deny or grant. And that component should also be context aware and be able to perform adaptive decisions. And we'll get back to that. So in short, create relationships and manage them. So let's have a look at how you can use IRM for some real case examples for authentication and authorization. Let's start with authentication. So we can use relationships as an adaptive factor. I mean, this is quite in line with all kinds of things you've been hearing about throughout this week. You know, zero trust networking, Carta and all of that. Adaptive decisions is a thing, and it's here to stay, I would think. So how can you use IRM for adaptive decisions? Well, let's take our Maurice example here. Maurice registered with shoes. We're in the context of shoes, right, where he bought his shoes. And he registered anonymously as JDO1. That's who he is. Anyway, we noticed that every time that JDO1 connects to our store, JDO1 usually goes through this sequence of pages. It goes from the home page to the browse page, selects some items, goes to the checkout to buy, and then enters his credit card, and that's the end of the transaction. Good, so we've stored this in our graph database, and that's what we know about JDO. One day, a bit later on, JDO1 logs in. Okay, we know JDO, we pull his context from the database, and we keep it inside. Now, JDO tries to access a protected resource. We check our access policies. Yeah, JDO can access those resources. He has the grants to that. Great. Let's check his context at that point. In this session, it turns out that JDO went straight from the home page to the credit card page. If we compare the context, then we discover a pretty significant discrepancy. At that point, you can decide to either deny access or maybe request another form of authentication. Right? So, in short, be adaptive. How can you use this for authorization? Well, authorization is actually one of the most common use cases we see for IRM. We've had a lot of these cases. So we use it for modeling complex, sometimes very complex access policies, sometimes involving millions of entities connected in all kinds of complicated ways. So you can do that with graphs and IRM. And determining authorization, or if somebody is granted access or not, usually boils down to finding a path. This is what it could look like. Let's say that this is a little portion of your graph database where JDO is the subject and has that identity down there. That identity is actually a member of a group who has been granted a privilege that gets them access to a scope of a web service, for example, at the bottom. Well, if you want to determine whether JDO1 can access that scope on that resource, you can actually find a path like that. If you find this path, then you can say, yeah, he can access it. Doing a path query like that on a graph database is super fast, and it doesn't change no matter how many nodes you have in your database. It's always going to be the same time, which is quite great, actually, quite phenomenal. So let's pause for a second and have another reality check of how we can use that in real life. This is taken from an example we've had with a client just very recently. I'll call it the telco device authorization framework. I changed the names, but it's the same use case, simplified. Let's say we are a company, a telco company called T-Zone Mobile. Anyway, we have a reseller called Best Telcos. Gee, it sounds like tacos. I just realized. Anyway, Best Telcos has a client, a customer called Mobile Zone. Mobile Zone has a firewall, and that firewall has a couple of scopes, read and update firmware. Now, that client has purchased our framework to protect that firewall. And so they created also a permission that grants access to the update firmware scope. We're good? Maurice actually works for Mobile Zone, and he has been granted that permission. Still good? So now here's our authorization question. Can user Joe Doe read logs from device firewall 1? So that's a question we typically get as identity professionals, right? So we usually solve that, as I mentioned, by finding a path. These are our start and end nodes. And for example, here is a path between them. Now we also have a business rule that says you need an explicit grant to the scope in order to be granted access to it. In that particular case, there's no such grant here, and so therefore, Joel doesn't have access to read the logs. Note, though, that he would have access to update the firmware, right? I'll let you ponder that on the graph there. Yeah? Okay. Moving on. Another example, same company, we're still T-Zone Mobile here, and we have another reseller called Telcos Forever. Check, I read tacos every time. Tacos Forever has a customer called Mob Inc., which has a web service called Inventory. And that service has a couple of scopes, get and post. We also have another client called SuperDuper. They bought directly from us, didn't go through a reseller. And they have a service called sysusers that has a scope called post. Great. Maurice is there as well, he's everywhere. He's part of SuperDuper as well as customer Mob Inc. I mean, that's not uncommon either. He has actually been granted those two scopes explicitly. So here's a question that we typically get. What does Joel Doe have access to, right? It's something you usually get. Well, as I mentioned, it usually boils down to finding a path. So going through Mob Inc., here's the path we can get through Mob Inc. to the service, and we can answer that Maurice has access to the inventory service and get and post. You can all see that. Let's see what happens on the other side. On the other side, he may have access to this service, the sysuser service, but there is no direct grant to the post. So in that particular case, he will not have access to that service. Make sense? So in other words, use your relationships. You've created them, you're managing them, use them. I guess we're concluding now. These are basically the things I'd like you to take away from this session. When you're dealing with customer identity and access management, always be context aware, be adaptive, create and manage your relationships, and use your relationships for authentication and authorization. In short, implement IRM. And that leaves us 5 minutes for questions, if you have any. Yeah, you were first.
Yeah, how have you seen the implementations of GraphDB on CIAM platforms to represent complex B2B2C type of relationships? Reseller example you showed,
yeah.
We see all the time.
Yeah. I mean, you can represent, if you're using IRM and graphs, you can pretty much represent whatever you want. So reseller, as an example, totally can do that. And that's actually a use case we've had this year even. Yeah.
So in one of the examples you said, we browsing, checkout,
Right.
payment, etc. It sounds like a little bit like tracking within the application. How does this fit with GDPR, etc.? Are we capable of
Yeah.
explaining the purpose of all that together?
Well, I guess we could use that as a. I mean, we're using that as a security measure for GDPR. I think lots of challenges are with the right to be forgotten, in my experience. So you could delete the user node and delete all the sequence starting from that node. So you could delete the whole path, I guess. You could do that. Now, how do you explain the justification of this? Well, it's another. I guess. Yeah, we did not have that question come up yet, but I would imagine that you could say you can disable or enable it. It's up to you. You would add more security, I guess, to your profile or not. You don't have to do this all the time, obviously. So you could toggle it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering whether it makes sense to not only have the nodes, but and the links to the nodes, but also attributes against nodes and their connections.
Yeah. So the question was, we have a graph there. I showed some graphs with nodes and permissions. Would it make sense sometimes to have also attributes? Right? And yes, totally. It actually depends on the questions you're asking. If the attribute is important to the query you're making, then totally you can export any attribute as a node. There's no limitation there. It's actually a very flexible model. It's actually maybe too flexible because you could do whatever you want and could shoot yourself in the foot maybe, but you can definitely accommodate that. And we've done it actually. We're working on the white paper now for ABAC using graphs. And so that's kind of the approach where you have your nodes as nodes, your attributes as nodes.
But you need to flatten everything into nodes and connections.
Well, you end up with nodes and connections. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So you tracked or you graphed out the user interaction, but you could also extend that to user plus device, right?
Oh yeah, because I didn't show it, but for sure you would have maybe user owns device, right. And then from there you could do whatever you want. Delegate access to the device by adding. Yeah.
It could help with authorization or
yeah.
authentication decisions based on you've seen that device before and who's purchased.
Sure.
With that mechanism, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
And more transient object like session, for example.
Yeah.
Current session.
Yeah.
Is GraphDB
yeah.
performance enough to store transient
yeah.
object?
We actually, that's an interesting one because we are building our own little tool for IRM, our own tool. Anyway, we actually store sessions in the graph. We build our own plugins to the graph database for hashing passwords and all of that. We still need to do some performance tuning, but so far it's been quite fast. I mean, we didn't have any issues with that. And you can actually even start your queries at the session object. Instead of starting at the subject object, you can even start at the session object. Yeah. Anything else?
So it would seem like you could, like in your example where, again, went from homepage,
yeah.
found an object, found an item, and purchased it, and then he does something for him that's out of the ordinary.
Right.
But I would imagine that you could also have, well, for folks who already own
yep.
similar things, there's probably some context in a general sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pull away from the individual as an identity.
Yeah.
And use those attributes, maybe as an attribute or whatever.
Sure.
And determine, well, for him it's out of the ordinary, but not general.
Well, I mean, yeah, for sure. It depends on how you're looking at your comparison and how you compute the risk, basically on the delta. But it really depending on your business. But totally, yes, you could totally say that. You can generalize, and you can actually. That's the recommendation part that I've talked about. I mean, you can also the graphs are great for that as well. user A bought this, then maybe you're friends with that person. They also, anyway. Oh, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Thanks for attending and enjoy the rest of the day.